You ready, Mr. Brisco?
Ready, bro.
Welcome to Stories of Brisco and Bradshaw. I would be Bradshaw. That would be your Chickasaw native, your Chickasaw Hall of Famer, Oklahoma's favorite son. And we got a great treat today. One of wrestling's true journalists, one of wrestling's true historians, Sex, Lies, and Headlocks, the final bell among the books that he has written. He is Mr. Mike Mooneyham. Mike, welcome to the show.
Man, it's a pleasure to be on the show. Jerry finally talked me into it. I was never going to do a podcast again. I made a vow, and Jerry called me and put the full court press on me, and here I am, for better or worse.
Well, I did, Mike, and I'm glad I did because we've been wanting you on for a long time. And John and I kind of started experimenting around with our format of how we do our shows. We started doing some history on these territories. There's a lot of fans out there, that love the old territory days, and because a certain group of brothers that were accused of killing the territories off a few years back, and we want to bring them back, and half the brother team does anyway. We want to bring them back. So, Mike, welcome, and man, what a territory you grew up in watching and everything. I want to get into that a little bit later, but I want to tell John and the fans out there. John, Mike probably had as much as getting our buddy, our partner, Thunderbolt Patterson into the Hall of Fame as anybody. When we first started kind of working with Bolt, after a few years absent, Mike was the first one I called because I knew Mike kept in touch with Bolt all the time. I said, Mike, you think I'm getting ready to put him in the Iowa Hall of Fame up there. You think he's physically able to do it, and not only physically able, but mentally ready to do something like that? And he said, yes, he is. I'll vouch for him. So I went on Mike's word, and everything since then just been roses for Thunderbolt and myself. And I want to thank Mike for always putting those words of encouragement and positivity into Thunderbolt, and keeping him going and keeping him active like he's done through these years. So, man, what a thrill it was to see Thunderbolt up there, right, Mike?
Oh man, look, I was so happy when he was inducted into the Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame in 2019. I told him, Bolt, you're going to have a time. It's going to be great. And the funny thing is, Thunderbolt is from Waterloo. He was born in Waterloo, Iowa. And I said, Bolt, this is meant to be. You're meant to be in that Hall of Fame in Waterloo. And he had such a great time there. Thank you, Jerry, for all the accommodations and the encouragement you gave Thunderbolt. But this thing with the WWE Hall of Fame, it just came out of the blue. I was talking to Bolt one day, and he said, Mike, I'm not supposed to mention it to anybody, but I got to let you know, I'm going to be in the WWE Hall of Fame. And I looked at the calendar, and I said, wait a minute, it's not April 1. It's not April Fool's Day. And he said, no, I'm serious. They're going to induct me into the Hall of Fame. And I said, all right, who's pulling the rib on you, Jerry? He said, look, I talked to Jerry. He's serious. I'm going to be in the Hall of Fame. What do you think? And I said, Bolt, you just made my day. I cannot believe it. But you know what? You've come full circle. There's no one more deserving to be in that Hall of Fame than you. And I was a little, I didn't know for sure if he was going to go through it. And I talked to you, and you said, look, he's going to do it. He's excited about it. And just talk to him a little bit, which I did. And I talked to him 2 nights ago. The man said he's booked through December.
Right. Yeah.
That's
said,
great.
You're going to get so much attention from this deal. He said, Mike, I kid you not, I am booked through the end of the year. And I'm just, man, Bolt's 83, and better late than never. But he really took a long route to be honored like this. And Jerry, you're a big reason. So my thanks go to you, brother.
Well, thank you for
Mike,
all your help.
Mike, for all those out there that don't know the story of Bolt, why did it take so long?
Well, Bolt was one of those guys back in the 70s that he sort of went against the grain. The racial discrimination was rampant back then. And Bolt thought he deserved better, which he did. Bolt, he was Blackjack Mulligan, Dusty Rhodes. They all got that shucking and jiving promo style from Bolt. He was a pioneer. He was a pace setter. but he got blackballed from the NWA, and a lot of stuff went down during the Georgia wrestling wars of the '70s. And he went to the other side. He went with Ann Gunkel, Ray Gunkel's widow, and they were rival opposition uh, to the NWA. Uh, so he got in a lot of trouble. He made a lot of comments that a lot of promoters didn't like, and he was on the blacklist for a long time. But man, he never backed down. He could have said, "Okay, I'm going to take what you give me," but he wanted more, and by golly, he's getting it now. He's getting that recognition he so richly deserved for all of those years. And Bolt knew how to pack the house. I mean, I am telling you, this is no. He could talk people into the building. He really could. I was mesmerized. I was sort of a young guy back then, and I covered wrestling, and I was mesmerized by this dude. He was like a street preacher out there, yeah, selling tickets to the wrestling shows. He was very dynamic, and he was. I told him the other night. I said, Bolt, you're still packing the house. You're still selling out. I mean, the Hall of Fame crowd, what, 15, 16,000, international TV. I said, you still got it, brother.
It's such a lost art. I was watching a documentary the day, and I've seen it, I don't know how many times. I'm a big Evil Knievel fan. It's I am Evil Knievel. And they talk about his jump in Wembley, where he only had sold a few thousand tickets when he went over there. And the first thing when he landed was, he talked to the stadium full. There's very few guys that can do that. He spent the whole week just going around England saying, "Hey, I'm so glad that we bailed you guys out of the war. So glad what you've done since we've come over here and helped you."
That's it.
The whole arena showed up to watch him die, which he almost did. But
I remember that. I remember that.
It's just an art. You talk them in. Michael Hayes had that ability. So there's many guys that had it, but
it can really do it.
It wasn't a plethora of guys. You had but it was a really unique trait.
It really is, and Bolt certainly had it. And he still has it.
He still has it.
I told him, I said, Bolt, I'm talking to you right now, and it's 2024, but it could just as easily be 1974. It could be 50 years ago. You sound the same. You're still Bolt, man. You're still Thunderbolt Patterson.
He can still go, man.
And at the Hall of Fame, Jerry and I was there backstage. We got sat out there on the stage, but we got to be backstage with all the guys that were going in. Bolt stole the show backstage. Yeah. Bolt stole it everywhere. Everybody wanted to meet Thunderbolt Patterson. It was unbelievable. It's like one of these legends. Guy shows up, you go, "Oh my, I've got to meet this guy." All the young wrestlers, the old wrestlers, everyone.
I totally believe it. I mean, he just had that kind of personality.
The new day, of course, helped introduce him into the Hall of Fame. There backstage, they were like three young kids around Thunderbolt. I mean, they were just enthralled by the way Bolt carried himself, the way he delivered it. They got along so well together, and they went out and did such a magnificent job, along with Scott Spears. I mean, Scott did a great job too, introducing Bolt, but. Bolt had that smile on his face. When Bolt smiled, the whole world's smiling with him. I mean, he's just a dynamic man. So I want to thank you for all your help on getting Bolt in. But he's a part of why we're here today to discuss the great Mid-Atlantic territory. And John and I, since we started this little format here, who's best for this territory? Well, there's only one guy from Mid-Atlantic. That's Mike Mooneyham. So, Mike, thanks a lot for coming on here. We got a lot to discuss. Doing a little research on Mid-Atlantic here. The Crockett's, of course, 1938, Jim Crockett Sr. made the move from Bristol, Tennessee, down to, I believe it was Raleigh, where he made his first office in North Carolina, and in Raleigh, North Carolina, and started wasn't known as Mid-Atlantic, but started Crockett Promotions, wrestling, and then a little bit of everything. What can you tell us about Jim Crockett Sr.? Do you know anything before 1938? Who was it? Because the story I was reading said 1938 was a tumultuous year for professional wrestling. What was going on in the world of wrestling at that time, and what made it like that, if you know?
Well, you had guys like Jim Londo, Strangler Lewis. I mean, we're talking about old school. But Jim grew up, I believe he grew up in Bristol, Virginia. And as a young guy, he was interested in wrestling. He was interested in entertainment, period. So he started up a company, and he ran it for a couple of years before I think he went into Charlotte in 1934. And a friend of his named Bill Lewis. Do you remember Bill, Jerry?
I remember
He
the name, but I don't remember Bill. No.
he was an old promoter, and he got into partnership with Jim to run wrestling out of Charlotte. There was an old promoter there in Charlotte. Jim had done a lot of business with him in the past, but the houses were down and didn't really have a lot of talent, and wasn't a very aggressive promoter. So Jim took over that territory and brought in Bill. And I think Bill ran the operation out of Charlotte for a while, and Jim was still up in Virginia running that part. I mean, it started in Charlotte, in North Carolina and Virginia, and uh, I think it was 1938 when they took over full control, and it was really, Jim Crockett Promotions. And from there on, it just grew and grew. He promoted a few small towns. He promoted also out of Greensboro, North Carolina. He had a building there, and he had an old building in Charlotte. And Jim connected with the community.
Right.
He was a very solid citizen, and a lot of promoters didn't get that kind of treatment. The city officials were very skeptical of the promoters back then. But Jim was such a gregarious guy. He's big. Everybody called him Big Jim. Always had a smile on his face. And, he was convinced that he could make a go of not only a wrestling promotion, but an entertainment promotion as well.
Well, yeah, that's it. You hit it. I mean, he promoted, I believe, Elvis Presley. And Eddie Williams was a good friend of his. I think Eddie came into town a couple times for his anniversary. I'm on his wife's anniversary a few times.
Yeah, he was friends with a lot of the guys, James Brown, Louis Armstrong, just so many of the big acts back then. But like I said, he's a very nice guy. He he really appreciated his fan base, and I know if they asked him, he said he hated to see Cadillac salesmen because he was not interested in driving a big fancy car. He'd say, "Look,
Yeah, I'm glad you brought
fans-"
that up because a couple of guys got heat because they went out and bought brand new Cadillacs, and Jim said, "No,
He
get
didn't
rid
like
of
that.
them. No, we don't want you guys driving. We want you to be part of the community. They're not driving big new Cadillacs. Be a part of the community."
He didn't like that. He said, if I'm driving a big old Cadillac into the show, what are these people struggling to pay $1.50 in the balcony? What are they going to think? So, that's part of Jim's charm that made him really very popular, and how we maintained such a good business for, several decades.
Mike, what did the territory look like then as far as, say, 1938? I'm so interested in that time because before television, you didn't have the ability with the medium of, communication to be able to get storylines. Was there just regular towns? How did the storylines work? Was it through the newspapers? How did they get the word out for the wrestling? And
Yeah,
how often did they run towns?
They ran towns every couple of weeks. Like Jim had a solid foothold in Charlotte and Greensboro, and I think they were doing they were promoting some shows in Virginia. It wasn't like you were going to see 20 years later, but remarkably, these shows had pretty good attendance figures. Like 3, 4, 5,000 back then,
Wow,
which that wasn't bad for the 30s and the 40s. But like I said, they had a lot of the attractions there. Cowboy Luttrell was a big figure in Charlotte back in the 30s and 40s. And then
who went on to become the big promoter down here before Eddie Graham in Florida.
Before Eddie Graham, right?
Now, is that before or after he boxed Jack Dempsey?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You
remember that? Was that before or after?
I think that was after.
After.
Yeah.
He boxed Jack Dempsey.
Yeah, he got the hell beat out of him too, but he got enough money to start his own wrestling promotion, which is why
really?
he did it. Yeah, right, Mike.
How big was Cowboy Luttrell?
He was a little guy, man. I mean,
Dempsey was a real small heavyweight. He was just super tough and hit really hard.
Well, Luttrell probably 5'10", 5'9", somewhere around there, probably 200 pounds at the max.
Yeah. Because Dempsey was not a big guy. You know, the Manassas smaller. He just hit people really
But
hard.
with the thing about Luttrell too, they said he could take a punch, but he couldn't take Jack Dempsey punch. That's for sure. There's some pictures of him after the fight. You know, his face looks like a damn melon.
So, Mike, where did the transgression, not transition, where the transition, where did it go from, say, 1938 to, say, the 48, 50s? That was the advent of television. Did that change everything in the Carolinas?
Yeah, it did. The crowds the crowds grew bigger, and the publicity machine was in, full effect, and it made a big difference. But we were going to see even a bigger difference come the late 50s and 60s, and that's more of my era. I, I spent 60 of my 70 years following wrestling.
What turned you on to wrestling to begin with? I mean, was it the competition or what? The showmanship or what?
I was an avid sports fan as a kid. I played all the sports. I love boxing too. But me and a couple of my buddies were out in the backyard playing football, and they went on to become big college stars. So I said, "Well, let's take a break. Let's go inside and watch our grainy black and white television." This is 1964. Turned on the TV. The first wrestling voice I ever heard was Bob Caudle. And I said, let's stay a little bit longer. So we looked at this amazing spectacle. I mean, I didn't know anything about pro wrestling. I'd never heard of pro wrestling, but we were mesmerized for one solid hour. I saw these two foreign menaces, Aldo Bogni from Argentina, Branko Lubic from Yugoslavia, dastardly villains, up against a 601-pound guy in overalls with a horseshoe chain around his neck, and a good-looking young athlete named Johnny Weaver. And man, from that moment on, I was hooked. I said, this is something entirely different. It was like when Dorothy landed on Oz and the Wizard of Oz, and everything from black and white turned into color. I was hooked from that moment on. And then when they said wrestling coming to County Hall next Friday night, I said, what?
County Hall was the venue even back then, huh?
Yeah. How do you get tickets? So that next Friday night, I was in attendance, front row, 3-match card.
Wow.
July 2nd, 1964. Opener, young guy named Tim Woods, fresh out of, a couple of years out of Michigan State. Crew cut, good looking athlete.
No mask.
Against this grizzled veteran named Pedro Godoy from Havana, Cuba.
Right.
That was an opener. Good match. Second match, a midget tag team match. Actual midgets wrestling, right? Lord Littlebrook, Chief Littlehawk against this so-called Nazi team doing the goose step and everything, called Fritz and Hans Hermann from Munich, Germany.
Wow, midget German. That's fantastic.
You can't beat the Nazi midgets, right? So I'm in another world.
That's where I got the goose step from.
That's where you got it from, John.
That's right. From Franz and Hans.
Yeah, you might get a little heat for that now.
He got fired off of a job he hadn't even started yet.
Yeah, that's right. I got a little heat then too.
I remember. Well, anyway, you probably got your gimmick off of those little guys.
That's exactly right. I stole it off the little guys. I thought it was easier to steal it off them than Fritz von Erich. He might beat me up. And what was the last match?
Anyway, the main event, 2 out of 3 falls. Haystacks Calhoun, whom I'd seen the previous week with Johnny Weaver, wrestled the masked Bolos. Now, great Bolo and just Bolo. Sometimes they called him Mighty Bolo. I felt sorry for him. He was just a Bolo. He wasn't a great Bolo. But that match was out of sight. I mean, I was hooked from then. It was It was Katie barred the door.
Yeah, Mike, fill us in on that. This is a story I don't even know if John knows, but there's the Bolo that created a huge lawsuit. Was it then, or was it a couple of years later on over the right to use the mask, or what? How exactly did that go? It was Tom Ernesto against the original Al Lovelock, who was the
Yep.
original Bolo, and Al sued Tom. Wasn't that? Is that correct? Kind
Yep.
of fill us in on that.
Yeah, sued Tom and Crockett Promotions. But Al, who was originally from Windsor, Ontario, he was a Canadian. And I think didn't he work
He's still
Oklahoma?
alive. I understand. Yeah, he worked Oklahoma a lot. Him and Vern. He was a real mentor to me. Also, I think from what I hear, Al Lovelock is still alive. He got to be pushing 110 or something like that.
Well, he'd have to be if he's still alive. Yeah.
Somebody sent me on the internet. Somebody sent me a text, so it's got to be true that he's still alive up in Windsor, Ontario.
Wow. I think his brother was like a big politician in Canada too.
Yeah, he was. Yeah, that's what I heard too.
But anyway.
But this lawsuit, how did it come about? What was it?
Al and Tom had teamed up I think in Texas in say mid-50s, around mid-50s, maybe toward the late 50s. They had teamed up as the Bolos in Texas. And Tom had actually managed Al when he went up to Los Angeles for a while to wrestle. So Big Jim Crockett, Mr. Crockett, wanted to bring Tom in to the territory as a Bolo. And according to the story, Al said, okay, gave him his blessing, because Al got a booking job up in, might have been for Dory Funk Sr., somewhere up in Texas, maybe the Panhandle. And he gave Tom the blessing to use the name. So Tom goes down there and he wrestles his great Bolo and brought in his brother, Larry, Rocky Hamilton, the Missouri Mauler.
Right.
And they teamed. Tom wore the mask as the great Bolo, and I think Larry went as Crusher Hamilton or some name like that. But they were pretty successful, and Al came back to Carolinas, and he said, "Look, you can't use my gimmick." Well, see, he saw Tom was starting to be a really big star as a great Bolo.
Right.
So he kind of reneged on that, and Jim Crockett refused. Tom said, "No, you gave me your blessing. I'm gonna keep using this name." So Al sued Crockett and Tom Ernesto. Excuse me. I think it was for a $120,000 lawsuit, which was pretty sizable back in those days.
Back in those days, huge. Yeah.
Now, I never heard anything else about what happened. I'm thinking it was dropped because Al's main thing was that he had been licensed to use the Great Bolo name in Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, several states. But he was never licensed to use that name in North Carolina, which is where the suit was filed.
Right.
So obviously that lawsuit was going to go nowhere. And it eventually I believe it just disappeared.
Yeah.
And when did the law really take those things into account, that you were licensed in a certain state to use a name, right? Because guys use a lot of names. I mean, how many Infernos were there? How many Assassins? How many Destroyers? So that didn't go anywhere. But I remember that well. It was a big deal.
Yeah, it was a huge deal in the business. I mean, this was going on in the late 50s or mid 50s. When I got in the late 60s, they were still talking about it because Al Lovelock was just finishing up his career. Him and his wife Vern Bottoms.
Yeah.
And
well, Jack Donovan was married to Vern, right?
Yeah, Dandy Jack Donovan.
Dandy Jack, yeah.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Yeah, who was Al's wife? But anyway, she was his manager also. But she was a lady wrestler also. They were just finishing up, and then the Assassins, who were Jody and Tom, were coming into the territory there, then Bolo kind of disappeared because the Assassins had come in and had that bloodbath feud with the Kentuckian Grizzly
Oh,
Smith
wow.
and Big Boy Brown, which really encapsulated me into being a huge wrestling fan also.
Oh, it was huge. It was huge. They set records in Raleigh and Greensboro, biggest gates ever there at the time. 6-man matches with Stax and the Kentuckians against the Bolos, Assassins, and Larry Hamilton, Jody's brother.
So who were some of the original huge stars for Jim Senior, Big Jim?
Back in the 50s, it was the Becker brothers. Bobby.
Yeah, I knew George, but I never knew Bobby. What happened with Bobby?
I think Bobby, he was either killed in a car crash or he died naturally, but he was fairly young, very popular. So they were very over back then. You had Duke Kiamuka, Mr. Moto, a lot of those guys headlining in the 50s. And then
now this is the funny thing about our business, how we take advantage of everything. Just right after the war, so we saw a lot of Japanese and we saw a lot of Germans and stuff like that coming to the Carolinas.
And then we had to go to the Russians.
Yeah, and then we went to the Russians, of course. Yeah, and they had to run the Russians.
Koreans a little. I think we even hit the Koreans a little bit with Pak Song.
Yeah.
But it was the same elsewhere. Jerry, you know how it was elsewhere. If you were the Gaijing or you're the Gringo, wherever you went, you were the heel in the other country.
You were an automatic heel.
It was the easiest thing there was. If you're a visitor to the country, you're a heel.
Look at Larry Simon, who was a Jewish guy from New Jersey, and he became. I mean, in my estimation, I thought the Great Malenko was one of the greatest heels of all time.
Right, he is.
Gary, that's when real heat existed. Remember those days?
Yeah, yes, I do. Yeah.
Not this kind of heat today. There's some form of heat, but back then there was nuclear heat, and Boris Malenko was nuclear heat.
Yeah.
I mean, in Florida with Eddie Graham, and here in the Carolinas with George Scott and Sandy Scott, and with Wahoo in Texas and Florida. that was crazy, man.
And Jim Senior took advantage of all that, all the nationality coming out of that. So why do you think Carolina developed a reputation of being a tag team territory so heavy?
Well, Jerry, my goodness, I mean, 90% of the main events were tag team matches.
Yeah, but that was unusual because every other territory featured single wrestlers. And was tag team just coming into popularity at the time and jumping on it, or what was it?
Look, Big Jim used them in the 50s. I mean, not the large array of tag teams that he had in the 60s, but he loved tag teams. He loved them in the 50s. He took it to another level in the 60s. It would take me about 10 minutes to go through all of the great tag teams that wrestled in the Carolinas.
Start naming some of them all because they all ring memories to somebody.
If I don't cough myself to death. All right, let's start with probably the two most popular teams in the 60s, George Becker and Johnny Weaver. And George had the book then. Remember, George had the book, very important.
I certainly do, because I came in for a promise, and that promise didn't happen. I had to leave for 6 months, then come back.
Who promised you, George Becker?
Oh, actually, Rip Hawk promised me that Becker was leaving. That Becker was leaving and giving up the book, and he was going to take over the book. Then we got there, then all of a sudden Becker decided he wanted to stay because business kind of picked up on my arrival for some reason, and Becker wanted to take advantage of it, and I wasn't getting what I promised, so I called Mr. Barnett, and he said, "Come on back until they're ready for you." So I went back to Australia.
Johnny Ringley, he talked Mr. Crockett into ditching George as a booker, because he rightly felt that maybe we're overdoing it on the tag teams. He told Mr. Crockett, he said, "Look, tag teams."
Johnny Ringley is the filament. He was son-in-law of Jim Senior.
Yes, he was a son-in-law.
Francis Crockett, yeah.
For a while, yes, he was a son-in-law, and he held great favor with his father-in-law, and his father-in-law listened to him for advice. And he said, look, the tag team thing is sort of running out of steam because George Becker is now he's booking all of these 6-man matches. All the main events were 6-man matches. He said, what's next? 8-man tag team matches, 10-man tag team matches. So he finally talked Mr. Crockett into giving the book to Johnny Weaver and Rip Hawk.
Right.
And it changed a little bit. And I don't want to jump into the next page, but Johnny Ringley would eventually, he's the one that got George Scott on board.
Right.
And
He
then
brought
Johnny,
George Ed Wahoo in, Johnny Valentine.
that was a transformation.
But
But
that was a huge transportation. But like you said, we're jumping way ahead here.
Huge. But the tag teams, Becker and Weaver and Scott brothers, big babies. Okay,
George and Sandy Scott.
Main events everywhere. Fans loved them. Real life baby faces. Okay. You had so many incredible heel tag team, and you had Nelson Royal and Tex McKenzie, a lot of good guy team. Nelson Royal and Paul Jones, the Kentuckians, Haystacks and Johnny Weaver.
Oops. He'll come back.
Yeah, he should come back. Haystacks may have sat on his phone.
Haystack squashed his phone there. Haystack, I mean, you go through his, what a plethora of partners he had in his career. I mean, because he couldn't really do too much on his own. They'd do singles, then they'd double team him, and the local promoter would team him up with the hottest baby faces. And he had, everywhere he went, he had top baby faces as his tag team partner. We're just talking about the partners while you went away there, Mike.
Okay, yeah, I saw it. Okay. But the heel teams were incredible too. Like I said, you had Bogny and Lubitsch with Colonel Homer Odell. Yeah. Remember Colonel, who was promoted?
He was general. He was general by the time I got there.
He was general by the time you got there. But Hickory King, Carrion, Kentucky guy, manager, big heat there. You had the unforgettable.
Oh no, Mike.
Uh-oh.
The unforgettable. We forgot.
Yeah. Did you work with Haystacks?
Oh, I was a tag team partner with Haystacks in Florida, Oklahoma, Carolina, everywhere, Georgia.
You're the bumping part.
Oh, with the bumper, yeah. That's right. I asked Jack, "What do you do?" And he said, "Just bump and sell and tag Haystack." Yeah.
That's right.
But you had Rip Hawk and Swede Hansen. You had the Infernos and JC Dykes.
Did they come in as tag team, or how did that happen? Because you know my relationship with both of those guys. I love them like they're my brothers because they gave me my career basically.
Rip and Swede, yeah. Rip came in actually. He came in I think back in he did some stuff here in the late '50s, and originally he teamed with Rock Hunter. You remember Rock?
Right, yeah, Rock, yeah.
Yeah, he teamed with the Hawk and the Hunter. Yeah, Rock Hunter and Rip Hawk. And then Swede came in, and I mean they were meant for each other. Old Sweetles and Rip. Yeah. They were loved those guys. I mean, but they were a terrific tag team. Yeah. Main events, I think they probably main evented against Becker and Weaver probably 300 or 400 times.
Probably more than anybody, any rival ever.
Why
do you think Rock Hunter? Because Rock was really good. He's a great heel.
Yeah.
He just never seemed to get that final push where he was one of those top heels. At least a little bit later on. Maybe it was in the very beginning, but not when I got in.
Yeah, I felt like that too, Jerry. He had a pretty successful team here with Pampero Firpo for a while.
Right. Yeah.
I know when he went to Georgia during the Georgia Wrestling War, I think he was teaming with Jody Hamilton at the time, but he had a moderate level of success, but I think he retired fairly young, and he just kind of faded into oblivion. I heard He didn't really like the wrestling business anymore, didn't want to talk about it, but it could have been he just really didn't have his heart and soul into it.
Mike, during this time, what was your role? I understand as a reporter and journalist, but how did that integrate into the wrestling, and how much did these guys accept you, and how did that progression happen? You know, from this kid who first saw these matches with the midget, with the midget Nazis, all the way up to now all of a sudden you're covering all of this.
Yeah, now I'm supposed to be a legitimate journalist, right? You know, wrestling really led me to the newspaper business. Okay, because like I said, I was a huge sports fan. I read a lot, pretty good writer even for a kid. I started writing for these national wrestling magazines like Wrestling Review and the Ring Wrestling. Remember those?
How old were you?
I was barely a teenager. And I had press cards from Nat Fleischer from the Ring, Lou Eskin, Stanley Weston from Wrestling Review. I was carrying all these press cards around. So I got into matches all over. I covered shows all over the Southeast. I went from here to Charlotte to.
So as soon as you got your
Columbia
as soon as you got your driver's license, or before you got your driver's license, you were on the road doing the interviews.
I was on the road. I was on the road before whoever was going south or whatever. I was, I covered shows, Columbia, Greenville, Savannah, Atlanta, Orlando, Miami Beach. I was all over the circuit. So I got to know a lot of these guys, right? And one person he was one of my dearest friends until the day he died at the age of 93. And Jerry, you're going to be very familiar with him. Henry Marcus, our promoter.
I was going to ask you about Henry, Joe, and Bill, and some of those other local guys that Jim had working for him as we progress here.
Yeah, he told me so many great stories about his days, on the trains with Joe Dempsey. And I mean, he met so many people. Dick Clark, he promoted all these guys, the Dick Clark Rock and Roll Review.
He probably promoted Jimmy Hart, Jimmy Hart, because Jimmy was on that Dick Clark Rock and Roll Review show.
Yeah, and this was even before. This was like in the Little Richard days, right, in the 60s. He used to chase Little Richard out of the building. Little Richard would come and, be loud and everything. When he was a kid, he was a big wrestling fan. And Henry Marcus told me he used to have to chase him out the building sometime. But, yeah.
Mr. Brisco chased Slick out of the building one time.
You did?
Yeah.
Gary, you chased the Reverend Johnson?
The Reverend Johnson Slick, yeah.
Speaking of Slick.
He was, we were doing a shot down in Miami at James L. Knight Center. The afternoon show where these buildings booked 2 shows. They booked a boxing show with Mike Tyson. So all the Tyson guys were hanging around wanting to see the wrestling. Of course, all of our wrestlers came early so they could see Tyson. So trying to separate, the boxer from the wrestler was kind of hard to do. And I'm with the wrestler, I'm with the box, So Slick standing back there. I'd done all afternoon. All I'd done was chase these guys out of the dressing room. I see this tall guy, Slick. Slick hadn't even been on TV yet, but he was on the road. So I go, "Sir, you're gonna have to wait outside." But I'm with the show. I said, "Sure you are." I said, "Thank you. You still wait outside." So finally found whoever is managing that night, and they come up and he's with us. And he has never let me forget it in that 40 years.
Speaking of Slick, you remember Rufus R. Freight Train Jones?
Rufus R. I never will forget Rufus R. Yeah.
My name is Rufus R. Jones, and the R stands for guts.
Yeah.
That's great. That is great.
So I
love when guys in all seriousness say stuff wrong. Hacksaw used to always go, "Listen, it's ready, fire, aim." wait a minute. No, it's not. But it makes sense.
Yeah.
Or Rufus, I'm gonna
go ahead. I'm sorry.
Rufus, I'm gonna get my revenge on you, Ken Pater, Ric Flair, Oleander, Wahoo McDaniels. Yeah, great promos.
Rufus R was great. So you're on the road as a preteen. You're getting wrestling stories. You got press credentials from everybody.
Yes, seeing all.
So what are your parents? Are you getting support from your parents, or they're saying, "Mike, you need a real job"?
Well, I guess my real job at the time was going to school. and sometimes school interfered with my wrestling passion. But I don't want to go too far into the future, but I remember back in 2009 in Waterloo, Iowa, being inducted into the Hall of Fame there. I said, what would my parents say now? They used to always ask me, Mike, what are you going to do with this stuff, right? What are you going to do with this stuff? And here I am, 40, 50 years later in
You're on
Waterloo,
Brisco
Iowa.
and Bradshaw podcast.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, I mean the cream of the crop, right?
Absolutely.
On the JBL Brisco. What is it? Brisco JBL or JBL Brisco?
Brisco Bradshaw.
Brisco Bradshaw. Okay.
Yep, Brisco Bradshaw. Stories with Brisco and Bradshaw.
You defer to the older member of this.
Of course I do.
I'm old and he respects his elders. That's one thing John does. He respects his elders.
Well, okay, so I went to school, went to college.
Did you go to Clemson? Is that where you went?
No, I had some deaths in the family, which precluded me from leaving town at the time. So my mom had died and had some other stuff going on. So I stayed in Charleston, went to the College of Charleston, $250 a semester, right? That's what the tuition was. And I got a part-time job at the newspaper.
Covering what?
What's that?
Covering what?
Well, it was a menial job. It was walking proofs up and down King Street for the advertisers, right? I was doing that in the morning, going to school in the afternoon, coming back to the newspaper. And I got that job. It was, I think it was meant to be. A fraternity brother of mine approached me one day, said, hey, you need a job? And I said, well, I don't have one. Yeah, it'd be okay. He said, well, okay, I got this little job at the Post and Courier. You want to, I know you can get it if you want it. So I said, okay. So that's how I ended up at the newspaper. But then I love writing too. So I got to the point where I submitted articles to the editor there, and they liked my writing, even at that age. And one thing led to another. And after college, I still had my job there. I went to Orangeburg, South Carolina, got a job at that newspaper. And man, I learned everything about the newspaper. It was a daily paper, but it was a very good newspaper. And I learned photos, writing.
Did
editing.
you do any write-ups on Sheldon Benjamin, the young Sheldon Benjamin, or was that pre-Sheldon?
Oh, well, this is in the mid 70s here, but let me take you up to like 1995 when I was actually writing columns for the paper. I wrote an 8-part series on Shelton, 8-part on Shelton Benjamin.
A high school kid.
Yeah, and he had a coach who lived in Mount Pleasant who drove to Orangeburg every day to coach him. He coached a wrestling team up in Orangeburg. It was like Shelton's mentor. He lived right here in Mount Pleasant. He was a big guy in the FBI. Tremendous stories. But anyway, yeah, I did an 8-part series on Shelton. Shelton was one of the most incredible athletes I've ever known.
Really?
That guy could do it all. In high school at Orangeburg Wilkinson High, he was a football star. He was a track star. He was a wrestling star. He had the goods. I mean, he ended up as an All-American in college, and then he went to Minnesota, became assistant coach up there. You know the history, but I did stuff on Shelton.
Hey, Mike, he won the 100 meters, or at least was an All-American 100 meters in junior college, and was an All-American wrestler the same year.
That's right.
That's unheard of, to be a track star that not a shot putter. You can understand that if a wrestler's a shot putter or discus thrower. He was a 100-meter champion.
Hey, he could handle Brock Lesnar in college.
Yeah, that's the reason Jay Robinson kept him around, because he's the only guy in the room that could handle Brock.
Yeah. And Jerry, we talked about it back then years ago. Remember, I talked to you and you said, yeah, you got to get in touch with Jay Robinson at Minnesota. Yeah. So you remember that. That's probably 30 years ago.
Yeah.
But anyway, went from college to the newspaper. Yeah, I stayed in Orangeburg for a year or two, came back, knew everything. This promoted me to sports editor. And so I actually had power to control our sports section, right? Now, only thing, this was an old conservative newspaper. We don't want wrestling stuff in there, but by golly, I would put them in every Saturday morning. from the
Was you
Friday night.
getting ordered not to put any wrestling in there, and you just did it? Or?
Well, let's just keep it to results, because
100
people would call us the next morning if we didn't have the results in the paper.
Wow.
So I started sneaking articles in, right? One Sunday morning edition, the Saturday night was the night of the big Jerry Cooney, Larry Holmes. Remember that closed circuit
Right.
extravaganza, right?
Yeah.
That was going to be big news in the Sunday morning paper. I used it as a little strip down at the bottom of the front page, and 3/4 of the front sports page was my piece on Wahoo McDaniel from the Friday Night Wrestling show at County Hall. We had great art. Jump to 2 inside pages, wide open pages, all Wahoo McDaniel.
Wow.
I didn't get fired, but they didn't love it. Right? But I was the same person who maybe 20 years later did the same big feature, probably the longest article I ever did, on Burrhead Jones.
Burrhead Jones, yeah.
Now, this is a Southern newspaper, the oldest paper in the South, the only oldest daily in the South, Pulitzer Prize winning paper, right? But I dare anybody to find the name Burrhead Jones in 60 point across the top of a page in any newspaper, even in 2000. Right?
They couldn't even use that name now.
No, but I'm saying that was only like, maybe 20 years ago.
Yeah.
But he was another one of my good friends.
Is that when Burrhead went into the Low County Hall of Fame there?
This would have to be probably a couple of years later. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But he was one of my great friends too.
Yeah.
So how much of the story, I mean, how much were you accepted by the wrestlers, by the promoters? How much of the story was in character? How much of the story was written from an outsider's point of view? How did that mix work?
I'm sorry I didn't answer that question earlier, John. I know you asked it about 15 minutes ago, and I went.
No. It's been very enjoyable listening to you.
But really, I got to know a lot of these guys, and they let me in. But see, because they respected me, I did not. I used maybe storyline stuff in whenever I did a story on wrestling back then. Before I started writing my weekly column back in 1989, we're talking about the 70s and 80s here. I did more like profiles on the people in the business, not what the angle was going to be or what angle they were involved in. It was character profiles, who's behind the wrestler, which I thought was very enlightening for a lot of the audience back then. My first newspaper article on wrestling, and I was still working part-time at the paper then, I think it was in 76, and I did a piece on Ric Flair. And that was the first time I'd ever met Rick. Behind the old county hall, he drove in his Cadillac. He had Scott Irwin with him. He got out of the Cadillac and said, "Man, this guy looks impressive." Like, so we talked later that evening, and I did a story on him. And after I talked to Rick, I went to the office and told Sandy Scott, I said, "This guy's got NWA World Championship written all over him." And Sandy said, "You're right. It's a matter of time, but he's definitely got it." And I did stories like that.
I guess also, I guess a further question is, how much of it did any of it break kayfabe? I mean, was it all, I mean, there's that fine line. You know what I'm talking about? There's that fine line where you do an interview, but you got to kind of stay in storyline, character and stuff. How did that mesh?
Like I said, I didn't go into storylines much. I got into the real people, where they grew up, who they were, real names. Look, I started breaking kayfabe back with my fan club. When I was writing for the magazines, I also had my own fan club, Championship Wrestling Fan Club. I covered shows. I had correspondents all over the country.
You started your own fan club, Mike?
Yeah, it's Championship Wrestling Fan
Way
Club.
to go. Way to go.
Hey, the fan clubs were precursors to the newsletters, the dirt
Right.
sheets,
Yeah.
years later. But I had
Wait,
known monthly.
you remember the name Wayne Lebo right then, of course, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
The president of Jack and Jerry Oklahoma Cyclone fan club.
That's right. That's right. I knew all the fan club presidents back then. And, I would print monthly bulletins. I had a mimeograph machine at home. I would get the stencils and I had the old typewriter and I would roll off copies of, the bulletin every month. I had results, a results section from all over correspondence. Probably Mike Tenay, Dave Meltzer, Norm Keitzer, all of those guys from that era, Burt Ray. And we'd trade fan club bulletins. A lot of my friends were fan club presidents back then. And I would have stories and I would have news and notes and I would give the real names out, the Assassins or Tom Ernesto and Jody Hamilton, all of that stuff. So that was pretty cutting edge back for the 60s.
That was bold for back then too.
That was very bold, right?
Were you getting heat from the promoters, from the boys?
Every once in a while. Every once in a while when I'd release, his real name or something. But I knew that was going to happen eventually. We're advancing in the wrestling business, right? You can't keep all of that secret. But I never wanted to lift the curtain. I didn't want to expose anything. But I would say who's coming into the territory. I would get promoters. I would talk to the guys. Like I said, a lot of them were friends. Hey, the guys I grew up who were idols to me, like Lou Thez, all those guys, all the guys, I'm serious, all the guys, Nelly, Les, all those guys, they became some of my closest friends over the years.
I know Sandy Scott. I mean, he was, you covered him as a youth.
Sandy.
And you covered him extensively. Then later on, Sandy became part of the office. So you had that natural tie-in with the office where these guys had already had that built-in trust when they were a talent, so they trusted you.
That's exactly right. And of course, Henry Marcus. Yeah. Always a dear friend.
And let's talk about Henry. We're talking about Jim Crockett Sr., his days, but he obtained, I don't know if they were there before Crockett, but he had a lot of these on-site promoters in town, the local Henry Marcus, who did Charleston and Columbia and a lot of little spot shows around there. Murdoch's, who did the Virginias, and then the guy over in Greenville. I think that's where Bill Lewis ended up under, with Greenville, wasn't it, South Carolina?
Bill Lewis died, I think, in '61. And Jim Crockett Sr. replaced him with Joe Murnick. Joe Murnick became his most trusted lieutenant.
But Joe wasn't in Greenville. There was a guy, I can't remember the guy's name.
Paul Winkhouse.
Winkhouse, yeah. Oh, Paul Winkhouse, yeah.
He did Greenville and Asheville.
Yeah, exactly.
He was a good promoter, too.
Yeah. But how did these guys come about with Jim Crockett Sr.?
Well, they were like all lieutenants. And, Henry Marcus was one of the oldest ones. And he let Henry promoted
hold your own ticket. Hold your own ticket.
Hold your own ticket. That's right. I'll never forget that. Man, those were the days.
Yeah.
And he promoted in Charleston, Columbia at Township Auditorium. He promoted in a lot of spot towns, Florence, Orangeburg, King Street, places like that. But he was more than just a wrestling promoter. He was a promoter extraordinaire.
Right.
He promoted everything from the Harlem Globetrotters to Elvis Presley, James Brown, Herman's Hermits, you name it.
Now the Globetrotters, what did Jim Sr. just about buy the Globetrotters at one time?
He did.
He did buy.
He almost bought it. It never happened, but he was interested. Yes, they were offering it to him.
Yeah.
But yes, Superman. Henry Marcus promoted Superman and Lois Lane, the originals, out in some place in the middle of Columbia. But he knew so much about the wrestling business, and the take he had on wrestling was just it was humorous. I mean, and all the boys loved him. A lot of them called him. Bolt still calls him Pops.
Yeah. I've told you that great story about him. You know, I mean, he was always trying to figure out a way he could squeeze a few more dollars in Columbia, South Carolina.
Yeah.
So the guys had free parking there, which they should have free parking. So it was in a side lot, and all of a sudden Henry came. I'm going to charge the wrestlers $5 to park.
The promoters charging the boys to park.
What a
promoter.
brilliant idea, right? What a brilliant! You're going to charge your talent $5 to park. That's like they're charging their employees at the IBM $5 where they're working.
That's
so
like
anyway,
Tony Atlas.
So anyway, Tracy Bernard was handling Andre at the time. So they're coming into Columbia. Of course, the place is packed. You know, Andre's coming into town. So, you know, that fire escape that sets off from the dressing room there. Me, Jack, and Henry are outside watching the crowd come in. You know, it's going to be a great crowd. And giving Henry shit about, you know, getting our $5 back for parking there. All of a sudden, we see Francie pull up in Andre's Cadillac. So the guy goes over to Francie's door, and there you can see him $5 holding up five in his hand there. And we can see through the window, I see Francie looking over at Andre, and Andre's shaking his head, no boss, no boss. And the guy kept $5. Finally, I said, Henry, this isn't going to end well. He said, no, and I'll give them their money back like I gave you guys their money back. I said, okay, this ain't going to go well. So all of a sudden, you see that Cadillac backing up and turning around, and all of a sudden disappear out of sight. Jack turned to Henry and said, Henry, your main event is gone. No, he can't be gone. There were no cell phones. There were nothing like that. So there's no way you could call him. You get your ass back here, you know. And he disappears, and Henry has to go out and tell, hey, I tried to charge Andre the Giant $5 parking. He didn't like it, so he's not going to be there. Had to refund the house that night.
Really?
And the very next week, we got free parking.
That's funny. That is funny.
So he was giving you the money back, Jerry?
Yeah, he'd give if you bitched at him, he'd give your money back. But if you didn't bitch, a lot of guys didn't bitch because they're afraid to get heat with the office. So, you know, if you got 15 guys, 3 of them are going to bitch. The other 12 guys you got their money. You know?
That's one of the dumbest things I've ever heard.
Yeah, but that was Henry Marcus. So he was a promoter, man. Every way he could squeeze $1 out, he would squeeze $1 out. Man, he made a mistake that night. He never charged the guys again, or attempted to charge the guys again.
You know, Tony Atlas came to County Hall and he went through the ticket window and paid his admission to the show that he was on.
Did he?
Yeah. I don't think Henry Marcus ever gave him his money back either.
Probably didn't. Well, Tony probably didn't ask for it back.
You know, Arn Anderson told me once, he said he always remembers Henry Marcus coming in the building weighing $1.50 and then leaving the building weighing $250.
Yeah. John, this guy wore those old zoot suits where his pockets went from his hips, and he always wore his high pocket. We called him high pocket. He wore his pants up to his chest up there.
That was
he'd reach down to his knees to get down to the bottom. Hey, Henry got changed. He'd be digging around. He'd pull out crap. How do you get all that stuff in your pocket? You know, he had those high pockets from his chest out to the knees. What a character! But that was all part of Crockett promotion with guys like Henry Marcus and Winkhouse. Those guys. Like
he was a very special part too. Everybody he knew everybody. You know, he would, even when he was, you know, in his late 80s and 90 years old, he'd come to town. Every time he came to Charleston, he'd come and he'd meet me. Like, he'd stay at one of the motels, and I'd pick him up, and we'd go to one of his old restaurant haunts. And everybody knew him. You know, these were like children and grandchildren of people he had known over the years at all of these restaurants. And there was a story. Everyone had a story about Henry Marcus. Yeah.
He knew everybody. I mean, as a babyface, top babyface there, you'd always have to go to community things. And I went a couple of times there, the mayors, governors, and everything. And the way they treated Henry Marcus was so different the way we looked at him. You know, they looked at him as this businessman, where we looked at him as just another damn local promoter. You know,
just one more promoter.
Yeah.
Oh, it's good.
I tried to charge him for parking.
That's so funny, Jerry.
So, Mike, what happened to cause Carolinas to explode?
Bringing in George Scott as Booker completely transformed the territory.
And who did he take over for?
He took over from John Ringley. Was actually after Jim Crockett Sr. died, John Ringley was running it until, they gave it over to Jim Crockett Jr. So it was Jim Jr.'s territory at that point. But George came in and just brought in.
I believe Rip was helping do the booking at that.
Rip was, yeah, Rip and Johnny Weaver was still there as well. But all of a sudden, tag team matches were no longer main events. I mean, every once in a while, we still had some great tag teams, but he transformed it into a singles territory. Brought in Wahoo, brought in Johnny Valentine, brought in Blackjack Mulligan, brought in Don Jardine. In my opinion, Johnny Valentine was really the spark.
He was a catalyst to me.
He was a catalyst to that whole transformation. And he didn't catch on at first, because John was a very methodical, used a lot of ring psychology. He used to tell me he could draw heat just by coming in the ring and picking out one person up in the balcony, staring at him with those cold blue steel eyes. And that was it. He had him. But Valentine, in my book, one of the greatest performers in the history of wrestling. It was just tragic, that plane crash. No telling.
Then not only that, but you had a young blonde-headed emerging star that was
right
getting his feet wet, being Ric Flair.
That's right. That came as a result. Ric Flair, Ricky Steamboat, for the younger generation.
Right.
And it was, Dusty would come in for shots. Greensboro was a big, thriving wrestling town. Terry Funk, your brother Jack, Dory, it was great territory. And I don't want to leave you out, Jerry, because I'm telling you, you had some terrific stuff back then in 73, 74 with Rip, and you team with Bolt and Sandy Scott. I know Sandy was he was a big mentor to you, right?
Yeah, Sandy was a huge mentor. Sandy was really my first tag team partner that I had on a regular basis.
Yeah.
Jack and I, a lot of people think we were tag team right off. We weren't really tag team until after Jack had won his belt and dropped it and went on to the second part of his career, second phase of his career.
Yeah.
But Sandy, when I come in, when Rip and Swede brought me in there, the original deal was I was going to be Sandy's partner because George had left and gone to Dallas at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So Sandy was there by herself, so Rip wanted to bring me, so they brought me in, and so that's kind of how Sandy. But I always tell people, Sandy's taught me how to work tag team, but Thunderbolt Patterson taught me how to draw money in a tag team with the entertainment part. And they were totally different partners, where Sandy was, I mean, he was strict in the ring. I mean, wow, he was so disciplined in the ring,
right.
With the stuff that he did, and they wanted it to be exactly right all the time. Where Bo was a kind of a freelance guy, you just go out and have fun and draw money.
Yeah, that was fun, drawing money.
Yeah.
So during the period there, Johnny Valentine comes in, Jim Crockett Sr. has passed away, Jim Jr. is taking over. And is that when you're starting to see you're transitioning to more singles matches? You got Flair upcoming, you got Steamboat upcoming, you got the Brisco brothers, you got all kinds of people coming to the territories. That's when the territory really caught on fire, right?
It really did, because honestly, it had gotten a little stale with tag teams. Those guys were pretty much aging out. They were all veterans. And, you got the new guys, the new blood, Flair, Steamboat, some others. And then you had these established veterans who could draw money, big guys, Mulligan, Super Destroyer.
Don Jardine, as you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, Don Jardine.
Yeah,
right.
Don and Valentine were about the same time coming there, because I remember going to George Scott and said, George, I've got heat with you. No, not at all. Why? I said, for the last 10 nights in a row, I've gone Broadway with Broadway with Johnny Valentine one night and Don Jardine the next night. He said, "You're learning how to work, aren't you?" I said, "Yes, sir." And I shut up.
Hey, Jerry, how stiff was Johnny Valentine?
As stiff as you here and stiffer.
Really?
I mean, those uppercuts in the corner, brother. I don't care how you tried to
Oh
protect
my
yourself.
goodness.
There was just no protection from him. He
No.
was and heavy. I mean, he weighed 275, 280. And when he was on top of it, when you were down, and he liked to wrestle on the mat a lot. That weight, you couldn't move. He was so heavy on you. And then those old buildings that Mike can testify, a lot of them didn't have that air conditioning. You're going out there, and a short match to
Oh my
JJV
God.
was 25 minutes. That was a short match. So you never went below 25. You always 45 to 60 minutes every night. And I'm not kidding you, for at least a dozen nights in a row, they switched off on me. Johnny Valentine 1 out an hour. Next night, Don Jardine an hour. He had another 6'8", 300-pounder. And stiff just like John. That's what George did. He brought in all these big guys that could still work the Carolina style, but they were bigger and more impressive than the ordinary guys that had been in there. So it wasn't the only change was these guys could still work like they could before and have the same work rate, but they were twice as big as your normal heel that you've been competing with, and that impressed the people.
John, I'm sweating just hearing Jerry talk about those matches, especially those
Mike,
buildings were not air conditioned.
And
Mike,
then people were smoking. People were smoking in those
Oh
buildings.
man, it was cloud, it was a purple, it was a haze out there.
Yeah. So you're
was the
breathing
worst.
in. All you're breathing in is smoke.
Oh, when you'd walk to the ring and you couldn't even see the other side of the arena because all the smoke in the arena.
Oh my God.
Oh my God. Especially if you're on close to the last, because then the whole arena's full of smoke.
Those halls used to sweat. The walls used to sweat at County Hall.
Yeah.
I was standing up there with Wahoo, and he said, "Mike, I've been all over Texas, hot country, right?" He said, "But I swear County Hall is the hottest place I've ever been." I mean, it was brutal. And they'd open up the building, they'd open up the doors at intermission and put in those box fans, to cool it out. But it was too late. I mean, that was a fiery place.
Mike, one time I'm leaving County Hall, and I throw my bag and back seat of my car, and all of a sudden I hear something in my bag. I unzip it. A damn rat that big jumped out of my damn bag. John, if you weren't careful, you'd trip over rats going to the ring.
Somebody put a rat in your bag, or did you just climb in there?
No, the rat just got in my damn bag. Or somebody could have put it in there too. I don't know, but it wasn't unusual to see a rat running around the dressing room.
Oh, you're talking about
I bet it was.
I'm talking about a four-legged rat.
You're talking about an animal, right?
Yeah. We'll get in trouble here, Mike. Thanks a lot.
You did have disco lights in your apartment.
Yeah, I did.
Mike, he had disco lights in his apartment. In his apartment, he had disco lights.
I totally believe it. I've got some pictures of Jerry, you and Les are at somebody's, either your apartment or Les's apartment, and you're sitting there reading a Playboy magazine. And you remember
my
that?
apartment. Yeah, it was my apartment.
That's your apartment. Okay,
Yeah.
I don't know.
You took those pictures. And if you look at it, there's one of them in that same magazine that have a picture of my stereo rack, and on top of it are my disco lights.
Hey, you were pre John Travolta.
I'm proud of those disco lights too, man. I wish I had them.
I would
now.
be too.
Hey, John, have you seen some of the younger pictures of Jerry back then?
I've seen, most of the pictures I get are off your Twitter feed. Yes.
Look, Jerry was in style. I mean, he had it going on.
Styling and profiling before Flair, man.
Yeah, you were profiling before Nate.
So, yeah, Mike, all those pictures you put up on Twitter, are those all yours?
No, some of them are. I used to take photos. Let me tell you just a quick story talking about taking photos. It was a dangerous place to be for a lot of reasons. Any wrestling venue back then, County Hall was one of them. And I used to take photos, and this is back in the 60s and 70s. But I think this happened around 67 or 68. And I had my little Kodak Instamatic. I was right up to the ring, right up on the mat. And this was one of the biggest crowds ever at County Hall. They had to bring chairs out on the stage to accommodate the crowd. It was sellout plus. It was the Masked Red Demons, who were Billy and Jimmy Hines, with their manager George Two-Ton Harris. You remember him,
Oh,
Two-Ton,
of course,
John?
yeah.
Yeah. You know, back then he had the red suit and the red hair, and he was all, they were a colorful team, right? Demons and Harris. They wrestled George Becker, Johnny Weaver. Well, George was the manager. So it was Demons against Becker and Weaver. Becker and Weaver had Klondike Bill in their corner. The loser would, if the Demons lost, they would have to unmask. If Becker and Weaver lost, they would have to get their head shaved in the ring. And they had the local barber on hand and everything ready to do that. So, huge crowd, a lot of heat in that match. I'm up there taking photos, and the crowd is very unruly. All of a sudden, I could hear a thud right next to my head, about maybe a foot and a half away. And I look, and it's a knife. Some fan in the balcony had thrown a knife from the balcony into the ring, aiming at one of the Red Demons, who were pretty close to me. You know, they were on the edge of the ring. But I swear, man, that thing just lodged into the mat. If I would have been a foot over, might have been killed by, at the wrestling show. But it was dangerous back in those days. Taking pictures. I remember getting hit by a woman throwing a shoe at Homer Odell as he was, leaving the ring with the police escort. And I was there snapping some pictures. And this lady just flung her high heel shoe and knocked me right in the head. I mean, it was dangerous.
Did you see the actual riots? Because County Hall, I mean, John, this is a military town, and there's a lot of military come there on Friday nights, really hooched up, and they were ready to rumble, man.
Believe me.
Did you see a few of those, Mike?
Oh yeah, yes. Sonny King wrestling the Super Destroyer. That was a bad riot. I mean, we actually had to leave the building.
Really? Tell us about what happened on that.
Oh, well, Sonny, Don Jardine was getting a lot of heat, right? He was busting Sonny King up, and there was a couple of fights broke out, probably racially, inspired, but it just kind of took off, and, you had chairs being thrown, and then they came in and said, "We please leave the building," and everybody had to skedaddle out of there. So it was, every Friday night at County Hall was an adventure.
Yeah, it was an adventure. Whether you're fighting a rats, two-legged or four-legged.
Those are other stories that probably for a different show, but saw a lot of that too.
Yeah. Well, you were a young, good-looking man at that time. I'm sure you were the innocent boy also.
I was innocent, and I made the mistake of taking my future wife to a wrestling show on one of our first dates. And she doesn't, she knows that she knows a lot of the people I know, friends, but she never wanted to go back. I mean, she went to a few events, but she didn't know much about wrestling. The only thing she knew was she had been terrified years earlier when she was young by Ox Baker at Athens, Georgia, at the J&J Sports Center or wherever that was. Ox Baker scared her to death, and her sisters. How Ox was very menacing. So she already had something against wrestling. But I was taking some photos. It was Roddy Piper, and he was heeling at the time, main event against somebody, and she was standing close to me, and there's one fan had a cup of beer, and he slung it at Roddy, and Roddy ducked and hit her right in the face. And she said, "Mike, I'm never coming to one of these again." But she did. She did.
Hey, one guy you hadn't mentioned, Tommy Wildfire Rich. When was Tommy? Tommy was all over the Carolinas, right? When did Tommy first come in?
Well, Tommy was mostly in Georgia.
Okay, he did he not work that much in the Carolinas?
No, it was, Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, those places. But I saw him in Georgia, and Tommy was literally on fire. I mean, he
Yeah,
was.
we talk about that a lot, just how over Tommy Rich was. A lot of people really don't realize that Tommy
Oh,
Rich was probably the most over guy in our business at that time.
he was. And then when they put the strap on him, that further cemented his legacy, even though it was, for 4 days. But he was Georgia Championship Wrestling. He was the hottest thing in the territory. And the matches he had with Buzz Sawyer, man, they were off the chart. And Tommy just had that charisma. I think he flamed out a little early, but I mean, Tommy's still, man, he's still making the rounds.
Yeah, I see him all the time at different things. It's so good to see him. He's just
He's
one
always
of those guys you gravitate to.
You do. That's exactly right, John. He's just one of those guys.
You know,
I mean, always a smile on his face. He was just glad to be there, right?
I've always, I got to work with Ricky and Robert, later in their career in Texas. But people say, what tag team would you like to work with? Of course, besides the Briscoes, but for me and Ron especially, it's Ricky and Robert. I
Yeah.
would have loved to have those little bitty baby faces. I mean, that would have been, those guys were so freaking good.
And they were good, and they were over. The girls loved them. I mean, you talk about idols back then. They were rock and roll idols for a generation of wrestling fans. And maybe they still are, I mean, heck,
they're still over.
Crowd.
They're still over with me.
They're over with me too.
I love those guys.
So, Mike, we're getting towards the end of the run of Jim Crockett Mid Atlantic Wrestling. What do you think really sealed that deal? Was it the move to Texas, or what exactly do you think kind of precipitated that JCP was gone?
It was a combination of things, Jerry. It was, the move to Texas, didn't need to put up an office in Dallas. The big jet they flew around in.
Yeah.
They were booking all of these huge stadiums and not drawing right. They were going into, Vince control cities. And a lot of
you think it was just ego from Jim Jr. or Dusty that caused them to do this? Because everybody used to say, man, why would you want to leave the Carolinas? You got 4 states here, and you do fantastic business in it. And it was one of the premier territories for generation.
It was. But I mean, let's be honest. We can list all those reasons. We can list the lavish overspending, the dusty finish, the towns, the plane, the Texas office, the corporate parties. Sure, they were spending a lot of money, but what you can't ignore is that tidal wave from up north. Mm-hmm. It was going to happen. I mean, Vince was coming in. It was a matter of time before Crockett was going to bite the dust, and you couldn't hold off that tidal wave from Vince and WWF. It was taking over. It took over all the territories, and a lot of the people who had been aligned with Jim Crockett got out. Like Bob Geigel, Kansas City office, and the Bill Watts deal never really materialized because I loved it. I loved the Mid-South and the UWF. I thought that was one of the better televised wrestling shows around. But they treated them like second-class citizens, as part of Crockett. All those guys who were big stars, and for Watts, they were kind of relegated to really mid-card status.
Mid-card guys, yeah.
Mid-card status, yeah. So there were a lot of reasons, but I think it was you just holding off the inevitable.
Was business dropping big time in the Carolinas at that time?
It started to drop, yeah. Back in 87 and 88, it was definitely dropping. The crowds weren't there anymore. Especially for the big stadium shows. Right. They were big money losers. So, I mean, they were the dominant promotion in the NWA for years. That was, yeah. So what a grand period of time that was. I mean, I was blessed. I think, I could have grown up in Kansas, or not to denigrate
Texas.
Not to denigrate any other territory. Well, Texas had that John Layfield influence.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
We were going to forget the Von Erichs and the Blanchards and
That's
you know,
right. It's all
the
about that John
Hernandez.
Layfield guy.
It was a John Layfield.
And forget that
influence.
guy from Borger, Texas, too. It's all about the John Layfield.
Oh, that tobacco spitting bad
That's
guy.
right. That's
Bad
right.
Who
man.
was also a big star in the Carolinas, who came to Carolinas and kicked a lot of booty out there too.
Yeah, when he came to, I guess it was WCW at the time, right?
Yeah,
It
yeah.
had to work with Lex. Yeah, that was, and he didn't enjoy that too much. I told Stan it's a good thing you couldn't see him.
Yeah, that's what he always says.
Yeah, it was a
Which
great,
we always considered an excuse. He just like potato people.
that's all the time, man. I saw it blatant. But yeah, look, I was just blessed to have been, you know, part of this.
Hey, Mike, I don't mean to cut. I'm sorry to cut you. I want to tell you a quick Stan Hansen story. I'm working with Stan in Japan, and Barry Windham comes back because we're in Budokan, so they want to beat Barry, not me, because Barry's about the much bigger name, so it means more to beat Barry. So Barry comes back, and his whole face is either lumpy or bloody. His whole face, like from here over, like because Stan's left-handed with that lariat. His whole face, his eyes like closed like this. And he comes in, he goes, Stan, the hell? Stan goes, thanks, Barry. And Barry goes, Stan, put on your glasses. So Stan puts on his glasses and he looks up and he goes, what happened to you? Like that. Like,
Oh gosh,
that's too good. It's just too good.
I love it.
Yeah, he was the best. Mike, let me a quick question about, you guys were for Starrcade 83.
Mm-hmm.
From that point forward, that's when Vince and WWF started poaching talent. That's when they got Piper. That's when they got Orton. There's either, I forget how many, either 11 to 13, some of that number, WWE Hall of Famers on Starrcade.
83, yeah.
Starrcade 83, and that's when they got them. That's when they got the Briscoes, but a lot of things they got with maybe with the Briscoes, and I don't mean to speak for Mr. Briscoe, is they got the infrastructure to be able to go to arenas and be able, because what it sounded like to me was that Mr. Crockett was not as good at getting closed circuit all the way across the country. Vince was. So it's also a logistics play as much as it was a talent play.
That's right. Yeah, Vince had he had the machinery at hand to work all of these, to get all of these big arenas. And Jim was just, he was not, he didn't have the capability that Vince had to do that.
Plus, and you knew Jim Jr. as well as I did. Jim wasn't really motivated. I mean, like Vince was. I mean, I worked closely with both of them, and the motivation in Vince's corner was just off the chart. I mean, you couldn't stay in the same room with Vince unless you were motivated. Jimmy, you could go in there and never get excited,
Yeah, you're exactly right. Plus, he eventually got this brother team, Jack and Jerry Brisco.
Yeah. But in our opinion, Mike, and I don't know if you'll agree with me, but we were losing. We lost Sarge shortly. We lost a lot of guys. But when we lost Hot Rod Piper, Roddy Piper to Vince, that to me that was the tipping point of the whole shebang. That's when Jack and I really decided, we're looking at the wrong place to dump our territory.
Yeah. And wasn't the money coming up a little short? I mean, the money was not there anymore, right?
Right, it wasn't there, yeah.
Yeah.
But losing Piper to me was really the block that knocked it all down.
Yeah, Jerry, it was inevitable. It was going to happen with or without you or Jack.
Right. Yeah, exactly. That was our attitude. Hey, we don't do it, somebody else is going to figure out how to do it.
You're right. And what I'm thinking about, I just want to mention what a great influence the Anderson brothers had on this territory.
Oh yeah.
I can't understate. They were terrific. They made fans believe. They were in the Johnny Valentine mode.
They were. Yeah, and either babyface or heel.
Babyface or heel. I mean, Ole could talk. He's another guy that could talk fans into the building, wanted to kill him. But what a and I've been doing a series on Ole. Really a fascinating character. I knew Ole for years, and most people knew him as this cranky old whatever. But Ole made made a big difference in the wrestling business.
Yeah, he's huge.
He, yeah.
I always tell
Was-
everybody, with Ole, I love being in the ring with him, but I hated being in an office with him.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah,
it
I
was
know,
night
right.
and day. I mean, being in the ring with him, you knew what you were getting. You knew you had to work your ass off, or he was going to eat you up, and you didn't mind that, and you didn't mind Ole being stiff because you just got stiffer back with him, and he appreciated it. But
He
sitting in
did.
sitting in those board meetings, he was a Pollock. What can I
Yep.
say?
Yep. I've got a little series going on in Ole, and the next couple of weeks is 2 parts of a deal that happened back in 1976 in Charleston when he beat the heck out of a fan. He thought he recognized the fan as someone who had done something to him in a previous, whenever. And Ole was leaving the ring, and he and Gene had those and he was knew he was going after that fan as soon as the match was over. He went over there, that guy, and he swung and cracked him over the head with his Mid-Atlantic Tag Team belt, busted the guy, and the guy
Which
was
weighed
like,
50 pounds, by the way.
oh yeah, and this guy said 75 stitches worth. He that guy was like 25. He was 2 years out of the Marines, right? He's a longtime fan. So he went to retaliate, and the cops got him and Ole, took him back to the locker room at County Hall, and Ole found an opening. He went over and the guy was already bloody, right? And started ramming his head into the radiator in the back of the building and busted him up even more. And the cops came and finally hauled them both to jail. And Henry Marcus tried to get the fan, in trouble. He said but the fan was saying, look, he thought he recognized me. I'm not that guy. And so they ended up not doing anything, but the fan got like 75 stitches in his head. I mean, and to this day, I talked to him recently. He said, man, I still love Ole. He made such an impression on me, even though he cracked my head open and everything.
You know what's funny about back then is like, so you get the cops finally realize, okay, he just made a mistake.
Yeah.
Wait a minute.
Yeah.
He may have made a mistake. He still assaulted that person.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not like,
And
okay, I'm sorry about that. Just a mistaken identity.
Henry Mark was still trying to get the fan locked up. They had to wait in the jail for the magistrate to come in the Saturday morning. And Ole said, look, I gotta be going anyway. This guy who was assaulted, it's funny, several years later, he became the state athletic commissioner.
Wow.
For wrestling and boxing.
For wrestling and boxing.
Right. And he said, several years later, Rick and Ole were coming into a club, and he was a bouncer there. And Rick came in. Rick knew him because he was, like I said, he was athletic commissioner. And Ole looked at him and stared. And the guy said, I just knew he knew me, but he wasn't going to say anything, But Ole was quite a character.
I thought Mr. Brisco was going to assault the Baltimore Athletic Commission one time.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
What did you do, Jerry?
He told me to calm down, and the guy spoke down to Jerry. The next thing you know, I thought, we're about to have to pull Mr. Brisco off this man. Yeah. Till he calmed down.
I forgot what that was all about. What did you do?
Ron had gotten his head busted open. We were trying to get on a bus to go down with Hermie Sadler to go hunting for over like Christmas break. And I needed a couple stitches for Ron's head. Ron needed a couple stitches. So I'm trying to get a doctor a couple stitches. Well, the athletic commission is going, who did it? Well, it's Big Boss Man. But now I realize there might be just a mistake, potato,
Yes.
Now I realize there might be some problem. I said, well, I don't know. It just happened in the ring. He goes, I must know who did it. And I said, look, man, that's not important. He goes, I don't need a licensee talk to me like that.
Wow.
So of course that didn't sit well, a younger me. And so then Mr. Brisco comes up and goes, now, John, settle down. This is our commission. And as soon as the guy said something to Cherry, me and Ron had to pull him off of it.
That Maryland Athletic Commission, they're tough.
They were the worst.
They're famous for being bad, man.
They were terrible. They were absolutely terrible.
It was always a joke when we went in there. Oh, you want us to pay you now so you can leave, or you want to pay you later? You know. Oh,
Mike,
we'll take it now.
Timmy White used to get the money. Then he would go to a local Irish pub and have some drinks just so the guys couldn't find him during the show. Then he'd come back after the show was over. He'd make the guys wait to keep the money. But Vince finally told me, look, we had enough trouble with these guys. Just give them their payola. Their mafia money. Mike, before we go, let me ask you a question. Magnum TA, how big would he have been not for that car wreck? Would he have been the guy?
He would have been NWA world champion too. He came in a very inopportune time too, because maybe it could have prolonged that territory, the promotion, just a little bit longer. But he was that good. I mean, he was over like $1 million. Yeah.
Yeah. So, Mike, what are you doing now that you said you're no longer with the paper? Because we had fun getting you on Zoom, which is the most fun thing we do every week.
You know what? I can hear y'all loud and clear now. I've been at first, maybe the first 15 minutes, I could barely hear you guys. And then I guess we just got to talking, and all of a sudden I'm thinking, I can hear these guys pretty well now. Yeah.
The best thing we do is get a bunch of old wrestlers used to rotary dial telephones on Zoom. You did very well, by the way.
Like Bill after when we had Bill on. Bill said, "Hey, I do this every week. I'm a professional." And then he got on with us, and we couldn't even get on Zoom.
He couldn't figure out the microphone. He couldn't figure out the camera. It took us forever. And we kept saying, "You do this all the time, right, Bill?"
This is on a small, this is on a regular size smartphone, right? Small screen. I've got a 27-inch monitor on my desktop, right? But apparently it doesn't have a camera. It says camera.
Well, hell, you never bought one. You got free newspaper computers, and then all of a sudden you had to turn in your newspaper, and you still had your 1920 computer from a camera.
Right. If I was still at work like 8 years ago, maybe. But this computer is 13 years old.
Well, no,
and it keeps.
That's more like an electric typewriter.
I got one of those.
I bet you do.
Yeah, it's.
What do you like using best, a typewriter or keypad on a computer?
Oh, look, at work, I was like a trained monkey. I could go faster than anybody, right? I mean, I was, it took me a while, but once I get it, but now, haven't been there in 8 years, retired, right? I'm still dealing with this old one. It keeps telling me, like, in a few months, this is going to be obsolete. We don't support anything. and it's pushing me, right, to do something. And before, I could go to my newspaper, but how do you do this? They'd show me. Now I'm here. I'm thinking, what am I going to do? How am I going to write my column? If I have to get a new computer, this is like seven, or I don't know how many updates removed. So I'm facing a crisis here in the next couple of months.
Wow.
I may just keep this until it dies. I've got all my, hey, this, you can't see my room behind me, but this is a, I mean,
wow! Look back there. I was going to ask you this question before we get down. That was the perfect time for it. It's a twofold question. I imagine all your 50 years in the business, you got a lot of memorabilia. What is your favorite piece of memorabilia, and what is your favorite moment in your career?
Okay, you see this book here?
Yeah, I see it.
That's Sex, Lies, and Headlocks in Japanese.
Wow.
Wow.
That's a Japanese version of Sex, Lies, and Headlocks.
How did it do in Japan? Japan's got this huge wrestling base, and of course, the huge side of WWE. How did it do?
Oh, for people who could read Japanese, pretty good. Yeah. Yeah, those Japanese people, they can, they're really.
Well, I just wonder because Japan is such a hot territory, and Vince was such a big deal, and all that territory, with between Baba and Inoki and all the things that went on with Hogan and Hansen.
Yeah.
I just wondered. I figured your book must have done really well in Japan once it got translated.
Enough for them to, want to publish the book, to publish in Japanese. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. That was, it did really well. But yeah, I got boxes I haven't been into in years, and it's like 40, 50 years old of tapes. And programs.
What is
But
your
you know
favorite?
what?
What's your favorite thing you got now?
Oh gosh, Gary, I don't know. Like I said, I've got a lot of old stuff. But you know what? I never. I mean, these guys are my friends. I didn't say, "Hey, I want an autograph."
Yeah.
I want this. I know Rick did it. Rick, I remember it's some autograph signing with Rick, and this guy came over, and man, he had like 30 photos he wanted Rick to autograph. And Rick looked at him. He said, "Are you kidding me?" And he said, "No." He said, he called him a few names. And he said, "I know exactly what you're going to do. You're going to put them on eBay the next morning." "No, Mr. Flair, I'm not. I'm not. You don't have to sign them." And Rick grabbed him, grabbed all those pictures out of his hand. And he said, "I'm going to sign every one of them." Bap, 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 dab. And he threw them back at him. But I'm not that kind of guy that ever asked for anything I mean, it meant a lot to me, but man, the friendships I had meant more. I never wanted to capitalize off of anybody, even for myself so what I've got is I've got like, I don't know what would be my, Henry Marcus gave me a lot of his stuff. He gave me receipts of, Rick getting $50 and whatever at County Hall, the payoffs. And I've got all of these old pictures, old 8x10s, all the old 8x10 stock shots. I've got all the Atlanta programs, the Charlotte programs, and photos. I've got albums and albums of wrestling photos. So they're kind of like all my babies. I love them. I don't get to see them much, but I think more than anything, what I value is the friendships that were, the stuff was a result of.
Right.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
your second part of his question, what's your favorite memory in the business? Favorite moment, favorite memory, whatever.
I think my favorite moment was being there for Rick's last match at WrestleMania in 2008.
I'm glad you said that one.
It was also, there was so many great moments. It was the year Jack and Jerry were inducted as well.
Right.
You remember Jerry?
Yes, I do.
Yeah. But that whole weekend stands out for me. I was hoping it was going to be Rick's last match, but it wasn't. And I was not sure it was going to be anyway, but it would have been.
I wasn't. I knew.
Nah.
You and I both knew, and that along with
We
thousands
knew.
of other people knew it wasn't going to be his last match.
We knew, but just that moment, because I spent that whole week with him, with the Monday night at Raw at the Township Auditorium in Columbia, and all the way through that weekend. That was my favorite. But my favorite moment is a compilation of every moment I've spent with all these guys we're talking about, and there's so many we didn't mention. And I just want to mention Jack and Jerry too. Jerry's been one of my best friends for so many years, and I thought the world of Jack. Jack was a hero. I wrote the foreword in Bill Murdoch's great book on Jack, and Jack was somebody that worked his way, from his bootstraps to being a All-American and being a world-class athlete in the amateur and pro ranks, and just a great guy. What a great representative of our business, and more than that, somebody who knew when to get out, and he did it on his own terms, and that is so unusual in our business. But Jack and Jerry are special, and I'm really honored. Like I said, people have been asking me for the last couple of years, do the podcast, and I politely explained to them that I just don't do them anymore. My mind's not as sharp as it used to be, and 8 years
You
retired.
couldn't tell from this interview; it's sharper and attack.
Well, it had to be with two guys like you and John. I think the world of you also, because I would tweet. I would send you a lot of messages. I love the references you would make while commentating on, WW television, and bringing up the names Johnny Weaver and Brute Bernard and all of these guys that all these fans saying, what in the world is he talking about?
And you want Mike? He got heat every time he did that too.
I did.
Oh, I knew that. I knew that when he said that. I said, uh-oh. but we loved it and appreciated it.
Yeah, well, you couldn't hide his love for the business. Even though he was getting heat from it, he still had to give his love of the business out.
You know
Yeah,
what it is,
and
Mike? I really do love the business. And when I see stuff, it reminds me of stuff. You know, as anybody who loves the business, you know, you see somebody reminds you of Johnny Weaver. You see somebody reminds you of Abdullah.
yes,
You see somebody
yes.
reminds you of something, you know, and it just pops into my head. And I say it, they go, nobody knows what you're talking about. I don't care. I don't
You
care.
don't care, and that's what I love about. You know, I used to call Flair all the time and say, "Hey, is Angelo Martinelli in?" Or is Jack Vansky? You know, these crazy names from the past that nobody would know.
Angelo
Except,
Martinelli took me to Preakness to see Secretariat when I buy that huge market.
Really?
Yeah,
Now that is a
Angelo
tribute.
Martinelli.
Hey, Jerry, I'll have to use that in one of my Did You Knows.
There you go.
Okay, what year
The
was
first horse race I ever saw, I can't tell you that year. I don't even know what this year is, but it was back in Secretariat, Triple Crown.
Wow.
Angelo the Stooge Martinelli.
I mean, John, he was a gambler and a half. He would have loved the guy. I mean, he'd gamble on horse racing. He'd gamble on anything you want to gamble on.
Hey, you asked me who was a star in the 40s and 50s for Crockett? Angelo was a star.
Yeah.
Angelo Martinelli. You dig up the old results. Most people remember him, or most old people remember him as a referee.
As a referee,
You know?
yeah.
Yeah.
What a source of knowledge he was. I mean, making a road trip with him when I was young
Oh,
and listening to those stories about guys that, you know, I didn't even read in magazines about. You know, it's unbelievable.
that's where the education was, Jerry. In
Yeah,
the
that's where it
back
was.
in the car
Yeah.
in the car. You know,
The
going from
backseat
city
of those
to
cars.
city, those baloney blowouts.
Yeah, exactly. What fun time, man. We were blessed. We all three are blessed. John
Oh,
coming along
yeah.
right at the end of it to be broke into the business in that golden era, you know, where guys like that, guys that people just see their names in the history of a magazine or something like that. We got to ride up and down the road with them and talk to them and listen and bleed them for their knowledge. Every one of these guys that you talk, you know, but old school Carolina, you know, Al Lovelock, you know, Tom Ernesto, Jody, Larry Hamilton, another Missouri Mauler, the guy that gets lost in history. But man, you don't get any better than Larry. And General
No.
Homer Odell or Colonel Homer Odell, you know. And so the old manager, what was the red-headed guy's name that was so good?
J.C. Dykes.
J.C. Dykes and the
J.C.
Infernos, yeah. Wow,
Yeah.
you just go back.
Yeah.
Those old school managers to me, Mike, were some of the classic parts of
Oh my gosh.
yeah. And that's
Nothing
a whole different story as the managers of old school managers,
Yeah.
man.
Homer, JC, remember Dandy Jack Donovan in Georgia?
Yeah.
Oh man, those were. You know what? We lived through some really great years.
Dr. Ken Ramey, I mean, another one.
Dr. Ken Ramey with the interns and the medics.
Yeah.
Hey, you know, I can't go without mentioning my greatest matches, and it doesn't get any better than Dory Funk Jr. versus Jack Briscoe.
Exactly.
I saw him. I covered him in Atlanta and Columbia and Charleston and Orlando, Florida. Man, those were masterpieces.
Mike, why do you think those matches were so huge all over the world? The two young athletes out there. I mean, they could just go. What do you think the secret of those matches were?
Those guys could. They were believable. They were excellent wrestlers. When people saw Jack Briscoe and Dory Funk Jr., they knew they were seeing the best of the best. They knew they were in for a special treat. When I covered those matches, I considered it an honor. I thought I was seeing something very special that it wasn't going to last forever, because those two guys, I mean, they were at the top of the list, man. And I love wrestling, and to see, I felt honored to just be a part of that, to be able to watch these guys. I watched a lot of the matches for fun and entertainment, but when I watched Jack Briscoe and Dory Funk Jr., I thought I was part of something special, and they just projected that. I mean, I can't explain it. When I saw the pre-match interviews, they conducted themselves like world-class professional athletes, which they were. They were not just wrestlers. they were world-class professional athletes who conducted themselves with such, it just radiated something special that, man, you know, I'm supposed to be a wordsmith, but it's hard to put into words. It's just a feeling. You know, I can't express it in words. If ever I saw Jack Brisco doing an interview on TV or Dory Funk Jr. doing an interview, I said, this is why I love the sport. This is professional wrestling. And that's it.
Wow.
I mean, Jack was a hero. He, you know, you talk about All-American. He was an All-American hero. And I can see him right now, man. I can look at you and see Jack. I can hear Jack. That is something special. And that's why I'm honored to be with you guys. Like I said, probably wouldn't done it for anybody else, but you called and I tried to talk you out of it. I said, look,
or you ignored me for 24 hours, but I wouldn't let you go.
I said, I'm going to wait a day and hope Jerry forgets about it. And Rich said, my wife said, he's not going to forget about it. And as soon as she said that, I ain't kidding, 5 minutes later, your message popped up again. And I said, oh, you're right. He didn't. But you know, I got to do it.
Well, thank you, Mike, so much.
Mike, thank you so much. It's been so much fun. I've been looking forward to you coming on since Mr. Brisco told me you're coming on. So it's it's been a lot of fun.
You know, like I said, 8 years retired. I'm still doing my column. They still pay me to do the column, and it's nostalgic.
How many years? How many? Put numbers. How many years you been doing that column?
Every Sunday, and when they asked me to do the column, I said on one condition, that it appear in our sports section, not entertainment or, you know, style section or none of that. I said I want it in the sports section. 35 years. Wow. Last month. Wow. 35 going on 35 years every Sunday in the Post and Courier. That's 8 years retired, but I'm still doing it. Hey, I'm like Terry Funk and Flair. I'm saying I'm retiring, but I'm not really.
Exactly.
You got the longest running episodic column in the history of columns.
That's true. Yeah, that's definitely true.
Longest running show in the history of TV, a variety show. You got the longest running wrestling column, and
y'all have to do the longest tag team podcast.
There you go.
That's right.
Well, Mike, thanks a million for coming on. I know I twisted your arm a couple of times there.
I'm glad. Hey,
but I'll do it again.
It turned out well.
Thank you.